Well, hello, everybody. This is Edward Dodge and Bruce Torres back for another episode of the Lost Goddess IO podcast. And today we're going to be talking about Old Testament. We're going to be talking about the historical Israelites and the contrast with the biblical Israelites, and how these are entirely two different stories, and how the historical Israelites were really a bunch of pagans with a lot of gods and goddesses and a mother goddess. And that they only transitioned to monotheism that we're familiar with much later on, and they had to kick out all these pagan traditions, and that's where we get the story of them kicking out the mother goddess Asherah. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. This is like kind of the heart of my book, and part of the history of the goddess book, and it's a really radical retelling of history that modern scholars have figured out, but it hasn't really seeped out to the general populace. And it was really the big shocking discovery for me when I started digging into all this history. Any thoughts, Bruce, before I start to kick off the historical narrative?
Do modern Jews know the distinction you just described?
Oh, now this is a really funny, that is a really great point you just made. Modern Jews love this stuff. They're not bothered by it at all. Some of the best, I mean, all the archaeology is coming from Israel. And so Jewish scholars and Jewish like newspapers and things, Haaretz, they publish all this stuff about like weed in the Bible and weed in the archaeology and the mother goddesses and Asherah. They say, they think it's really neat and interesting, and they don't seem to be perturbed by it at all. Whereas I think that the evangelical Christians would be more perturbed by it. Yeah, the Jews, they don't really seem to be bothered by it, because Jews aren't hung up on a literal reading of their history. They've always seen it as like the way they read the Torah is not like the way Christians read it. They read it, they're not beholden to the black and white text. The rabbis read it and study it and talk about it amongst themselves, say, what do you think? And what do you think? And they bounce it around. And they, and they're not hung up on these old laws. They're not hung up on the laws of Deuteronomy, like chopping your wife's hand off, they're not hung up. But certain things they are hung up on, like keeping kosher laws and things. So certain laws they keep, other stuff they disregard, all through like rabbinical tradition, and they're not bothered at all by these things from the ancient past, it seems like.
And my impression is they like to say Christians or Christianity, there are many variations of.
Well, sure, you're painting with broad strokes with that term.
Yeah, but no, thank you. Yeah,
but there is but it is important to make the difference that for Orthodox Christians and Muslims both, to have a literal reading of their Bible, with the Quran or the Bible, is very, very important to their like claims of authority. Whereas the Jews don't do these claims of authority like that, and they're not hung up on a literal reading of the text.
But they probably have,
and they don't seem to be bothered by the archaeology. Whereas the Christians are going out there to Israel, and they are much more concerned. They're much more passionate than the Jews themselves are about digging up Jerusalem and finding the first temple. This is that the Christians are really fanatical about it.
Right. Well, those sects of Christianity that are fanatical about
fundamentalists, yeah.
Right. I believe there are even sects of Judaism that one could fairly say are very, very literal. Maybe they're a small population, maybe they're a real fringe. That's my impression from my life experience.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into the story here. So in my I do in my History of the Goddess book, I take the whole timeline from deep in the Ice Age, but we're going to cut right through to where the historical Israelites are coming into the scene. So you get the Bronze Age that's going from like 3500 BC, and we get to, and so that goes on for a couple thousand years, and then you get the Bronze Age collapse, which is this really dramatic moment that marks the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. But from around 1200 to around 1000 BC, there's a series of complete disasters all throughout the Mediterranean. There's droughts and famines and massive earthquakes that trigger internal revolts, and then there's a series of migrations and invasions and refugees of these people called the Sea Peoples that do a series of attacks all along, starting in Greece, and then all along the Mediterranean coast. They attack all the coastal settlements and bring down an entire set of civilizations. This is when the Mycenaean Greeks from the Trojan War, this is when their entire civilization disappears. There's a 200-year dark age in Greece. There's no writing, no literacy, no trade, no governance. The Hittites in Turkey, they collapse and go away. The Phoenicians are on the Lebanese coast. They barely survive. Then Egypt had been ruling Canaan at this time period for the last few hundred years. And so they had Canaan under like an iron fist. This is the whole time of like the biblical subjugation, when the Israelites are said to be in Egypt in the story. In the historical timeline, it's more that the Egyptians were in Canaan. Egypt was ruling all of Canaan with a firm, but that all collapses at this time. And
where is Canaan? Where was Canaan geographically?
Canaan is Israel. That's Israel, Lebanon, Jordan.
Thank you.
Lebanon is the Phoenician territories. What is today's Lebanon on the coast is the Phoenicians.
Thank you.
And then
because I know you're going to talk about Canaanites. I just wanted to nail it in my head.
The Canaanites are the people in the Bible, and that's all Israel, Jordan, Palestine.
Thank you.
And so that's directly south of the Phoenicians. But it's all, in those days, it's all pretty tribal, and so they're not like clear boundaries. You've got a Hittite empire to the north and an Egyptian empire to the south, and then Canaan is sort of this borderland between the two big empires. But in the Bronze Age collapse, all of this goes away. Like there's 2 centuries of complete lawlessness and complete collapse of civilization. The old forms of writing goes away, the cuneiform writing. It was a really dramatic time period, and it's in this.
And what was the major cause of that collapse? You mentioned, natural things, but you also mentioned the conquering by whom? The
sea peoples. Yeah, the sea peoples are these. They haven't been entirely identified exactly who they were, but they came in these huge marauding. They were refugees, and they came in huge waves by ship, and they attacked a series of places. Ugarit, which is one of the which left us the Ugaritic text, which is where we get this really important mythology. That is one of the cities that fell during this collapse. And there's actually these really dramatic records of the king writing these letters and saying, help, we see that the invaders are here. Their ships are here, and our men are all away fighting some different war. There's no one to defend us. They're coming. And these letters were in the kiln. They're like written on clay, clay tablets, and they were in the kiln, and they found it, but that whole like palace collapsed. And so thousands of years later, the archaeologists found these old clay tablets, including these letters that were being written that day in the kiln saying, please send help. We need help. But the help didn't come soon enough.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to look up the sea people. Yeah, that's a pretty fascinating.
If you're not familiar with the Bronze Age collapse, it is a super, super interesting story unto itself.
All right.
And it sets the stage for both the classical Greeks and the Hebrews to emerge.
Pick up on your narrative, because at the end of this, I've got some comments about the collapse. Yeah. Yeah.
So, there's a lot of potential parallels today. People talk about it, but so the Israelites at this point in time, the historical Israelites, to the extent they existed, they were Canaanites. They had this all. They were not monotheists. We're told that Abraham is the first Jew, that he was the first monotheist. That's what the Bible says. So let me get back to the paganism. The important thing to read in the Bible is that there's 2 names of God in the Bible. We see God in the English text. We see it as God and the Lord. And when we read the Bible, we see that as one God. That's the same God, right? And there's no distinguishing between God and the Lord. But when you look at that in Hebrew, God is Elohim. The word God is Elohim, and the Lord, which is always in capitals, is Yahweh. And we're told that that's one God. But in reality, in the historical reality, is they were 2 entirely separate gods. Elohim is El, and he was the really ancient traditional sky father across the entire ancient Near East. He's the creator of the universe that covers all these cultures. They just changed the name. He's On in Mesopotamia, and he's in the oldest stories. The oldest temples are to On or Anu. And then he becomes El for the Canaanites, but it's the same God. And he is incredibly ancient. He is the gray-bearded carrot guy coming down from the clouds, like Michelangelo depicts. That's how he's depicted. This old gray-bearded guy, and he's distant and removed from human affairs. Like he doesn't really come down. He's the father of all the pantheon of gods, and those are the gods that are messing around with the people. El is like out there forming the cosmos, fighting with a Leviathan. He's out there in space. So his son, one of his sons, will be the Lord, will be the king of the gods, and every culture's got a king of the gods, whether it was Enlil for the Sumerians, and then he gets replaced by Marduk. Zeus was the king of the gods for the Greeks. His father was Kronos. There can only be one king of the gods. There can only be one Lord. And so that Lord is always going to be, it's like it represents like the political regime. So as one new like empire comes through, they're going to replace your one king of the gods to their king of the gods. For the Assyrians, it was Asherah. There was a bunch of them. So in the biblical story, Baal was the existing king of the gods, and Baal is the big bad guy in the Old Testament. He's the one that the Hebrew prophets are always going on and on about how bad he is. Well, he was the incumbent Lord. He was the existing king of the gods. And Yahweh gets introduced as a new character for all intents and purposes in the Bronze Age collapse. The original Israelites were not worshiping Yahweh. When Abraham comes along, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they never heard of Yahweh. They were followers of El, Israel, Elohim. When Jacob gets the name Israel, and this is in the article I wrote. All right, so I've got a whole article on the website about the pagan Israelites, and this is where all this is written up on the article. I should have mentioned that in the beginning. On the Lost Goddess.io website, on the homepage, there's an article about all this stuff.
.io. Yep.
And so the original Israelites were following El. And when Jacob gets the name Israel, the first thing he does is goes to the town of Bethel, which means house of El, and he builds an altar. And on the altar, he writes El Eloi Israel. El is the God of Israel. This is a line from Scripture. And they're saying they're following El. They're not followers of Yahweh, because otherwise it would be Israel would be the name of the country. And scholars have understood this for a long time, but doesn't translate out to the general public. So the scholars have like this. I just absolutely blew my mind when I understanding that Yahweh and El are two different gods. It completely transformed my entire reading of the Bible, and my entire understanding of the text was to see that these are two utterly distinct characters in this time period. In the first temple period, which is when the historical Israelites were around, when the actual historical nation of Israel really existed and the historical nation of Judah really existed. They were pagans. So they were originally following El. The name Yahweh gets introduced by Moses, and this is a couple hundred years later. They go to Israel. They go to Egypt. They have the Exodus, yada yada yada. Scholars say none of that ever happened. It doesn't really matter to my narrative. They were living under Egyptian rule. We know that much. We know that Egypt ruled Canaan with an iron fist, really, for those few hundred years. So Moses is the name that introduces Yahweh. And it says so when he meets the burning bush. He says, "How will I know you?" And he says, "My name is Yahweh, but I am the God of your fathers, but they did not know me by this name. They knew me by a different name." Because like they're introducing Yahweh for the first time, and the scholars have understand this, and so it's Moses that kicks off this reform movement. And what Yahweh is like the followers of Yahweh is they're like radical cultural reformers, like segregate, like anti-slavery activists. They want to end bad practices that they don't like, that they see going on, that the culture have been doing for a long time, that they see as completely corrupt. First and foremost is infant sacrifice, which was like a real thing that the Canaanites and Phoenicians, that they did it all over the Mediterranean, which was, and they talk about it in the Bible, and Yahweh's always saying how bad it is. And there's a whole thing with Abraham and Isaac where Abraham is instructed to go sacrifice his son Isaac. This is the pivotal story of the Old Testament, right? Is Abraham going up there to sacrifice Isaac. And at the last moment, he gets a reprieve and Isaac is saved. If you read the text closely, what you'll see is that Elohim demands the sacrifice, but Yahweh provides the deliverance. If you look at the text closely, you'll see that when the demands are being made to go take Jacob up on the mountain, the demands are being made by Elohim. They're being made by El. They're being made by the old gods. But when the bull is presented there at the very end in the reprieve, that's Yahweh, and it's a way of saying that Yahweh is saying, this is the way I interpret it anyway. Is that Yahweh is saying, I don't like you don't have to do this anymore in my religion. You don't have to sacrifice your babies.
Right. And you can imagine, in your article, you say that you can imagine that story, Abraham had sacrificed Isaac, and maybe the Yahwists got their hands on the text. And
that is one theory. That is absolutely one theory that's out there, that this story was actually really old. and that in the
Right.
original versions of the story, Isaac does in fact die, and
Right.
that later generations rewrote the story.
Right. It's just a little tangent. Also, just a comment on infant sacrifice. Was that not ubiquitous around the world for tribal,
So
indigenous, primitive people? And could
human
it?
there's all sorts of human sacrifice and ritual suicide all over the world.
Yeah. And how do we
Sacrificing war
understand that?
captives.
Is that just kind of a primitive? It's not. Maybe it's because there was a perverse, evil, malevolent thing behind it, or maybe it was just primitive humanity developing its reasoning and just kind of trying to propitiate the gods. Something about life has to come from death. Something about a ritual in the spring.
Well,
Do a minute about that. I want to know what you think.
well, there's a lot of different contexts for human sacrifice in terms of like killing war captives. But specifically to the Phoenicians, they have a very unusual practice where they had, and it was documented by the Greeks and the Romans, because the Hebrews were not the only ones who hated it. The Greeks and Romans, they interacted with it. The Phoenicians were powerful people, and they dominated the Mediterranean originally before the Greeks and Romans did. And the Greeks and Romans hated them, and they talked about the infant sacrifice too. And they said that it was there was a ritual that that they had that had to do with, if you ask for something really, really profound and really, really important, it wasn't just that they were doing it in times of like famine or times of distress where they were sacrificing something in order to like save themselves. Because that is one context that they have. It's like and this appears in the Old Testament too, when like your whole town is under siege and you're starving to death because you've been blockaded and everybody's about to die. And like the king would sacrifice his son, sacrifice the crown prince. And there's a story of this in the Old Testament. And that would be seen to like change the fates and change the fortunes. And you sacrifice the thing that's most important to you in order to like to appeal to the gods, and hopefully it works.
And also just at a macro level, if religions with a priesthood who could mind control his culture, his society, his tribe, was asking for the first fruits of their produce, their beautiful sons and daughters, the best crops and the best animals, with this fear, like, oh, he knows something we don't, and he's got them afraid of the God that we have to make happy. If he can talk, wait, let me finish the point. If he can talk people into killing one of their kids to the gods, they are stretched so wide that it's very easy to get them to give a lot of food and beautiful young daughters.
Yeah,
maybe.
Well, yes, I agree with all that.
Just psychologically, it's fascinating. It's just,
I mean, there's on one hand, there's always been traditions of like sacrificing the first, the first of your harvest and the first of like, of your flock. That's no big deal. But, and then there's like the sacrifice, as I was mentioning, like under distress when you're terrified and, and it's an extreme situation. But this thing with the Phoenicians was different than both of those. This was a specific, they would sacrifice babies not under times of distress, just in order to like get a prayer answered. And it was like a really bizarre practice that they had. And it probably was being manipulated by the priesthood, and it probably was very corrupt and disgusting. And there probably was perfectly good reasons why the Greeks and the Romans and the Hebrews all thought it was an absolutely atrocious cultural practice.
You can pick up the train of the narrative, my friend.
And so that was not the only thing that they did. There was also all the ritual prostitution, because these were very these are agricultural cultures, and their entire worldview is about how do we make the plants grow.
Right.
And they believe that in the aspect of sympathetic magic, that sex makes the flower, sex brings forth creation. And so in the spirit of sympathetic magic, like begets like, creation begets creation. So therefore sex makes the flowers grow. And so for us to make the flowers grow, we all got to be having a lot more sex. Like everybody needs to be having a lot of sex. We celebrate sex. We celebrate porn star goddesses, basically. I mean, literally the most popular goddess in the entire ancient Near East was a prostitute.
Right. And in a culture like that is going to make no distinction between the way they so-called honor men and honor women. There'd be an equality there.
Originally there was. And then as the equality fades, the women lose the benefits of all the ritual sex. Because originally the women kept the money and had the power and authority that came from all that temple prostitution. But you can imagine that over time, the men were asserting themselves over the women and taking it away. So by the time you get later on, late pagan stages, this is one of my theories about Christianity, is that by the time you get to that era, the women were embracing the chaste religion because they were tired of being pushed around sexually.
Well, but in the middle is the development you well described, the rise of monotheism and how that gave the men and the patriarchy increasing power to the suffering of women.
Yeah. So we've got so the followers of Yahweh are introducing these reforms. They want to end idolatry. So one of the important stories is when Moses kicks off this whole thing as a reformer. He goes up on the temple on Mount Sinai one of the times, and while he's gone, they start building the golden calf. This is one of the most famous stories from the Old Testament. Right. Aaron is Moses' brother, and some of the other folks, while they're waiting for Moses, gone for so long, that they build this golden calf and start praying to it. And when Moses comes back, he's outraged, and they destroy the golden calf and they kill everybody that was worshiping it.
All right.
Except for Aaron, apparently. I had always wondered where did this golden calf come from? Like, where did they even get the idea to have this golden calf? Because they present it as like this foreign thing, but in reality, it's not a foreign thing. That's the traditional worship of El. A bull of heaven was one of his symbols.
And the way you're describing Moses, all of a sudden to me, he strikes me as maybe a Joseph Smith who founded the Church of Latter-day Saints, or even L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. Like, there's the real God is Yahweh, and here are his rules, and I'll interpret them. And now we're going to have a whole reformation. And who did it stroke? Men who wanted to have more respect. Maybe they were the insecure, whatever. And it came into this dominance of monotheism, which again, you well describe as this awful, to me, it's awful, denigration of women with this domination by men, this unfair thing.
Yeah. And the cultural groupings are the farmers and the shepherds. If I didn't mention this before, the Hebrews are all shepherds. They're nomadic shepherding clans that take care of flocks of animals outside the cities. But the people who live in the cities are the farmers. Now that's counter from how we think of cities, but these were the settlements became the first farm settlements became the first cities. So the city folk are the farmers, and they're the ones with the agricultural rituals. They're the one with the goddesses, and it's the shepherding folk out in the hinterlands that are following the father mainly. And this is Cain and Abel. Cain is the first. He's the first shepherd. So the farmers are the shepherds are always denigrating the farmers in the Bible. Cain and Abel are a farmer and shepherd. The goodly Cain is a good, innocent shepherd, and Abel is, and Cain is the murderous, treacherous farmer.
Well, if the shepherds are, as you say, are nomadic, and they have to follow their animals who follow the climate, with that would come warrior skills, the need to be able to assert themselves in a new territory. And you could see there's the masculine impetus to become warriors.
They're also the traders. They're also the ones that are bringing trade goods around. And they're the ones who get their hands on the weapons and then start to attack the settlements.
Right, in order to survive as this nomadic roaming army, sort of.
So one of the sub themes you see in this whole biblical narrative is how the farmers hate the shepherds hate the farmers. The shepherding Hebrew prophets, they hate the people in the cities. That's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where they're like having these. What's so wicked about Sodom and Gomorrah? It's that there are these city folks with these licentious lifestyles, with these sex and drug kind of cultures, and then they get destroyed, and the shepherds celebrate that the cities get destroyed.
All righty now.
So if we go down into the narrative, in the middle of the Bronze Age collapse, what we get is Egypt leaves Canaan in the year 1140. That's when the pharaoh of the time, I think his name is Ramses VI. He's a minor pharaoh. He withdrew. The only thing he's known for is that he withdrew from Canaan, and that left Canaan ungoverned. And that's when when the archaeologists find the Israelite hilltop settlements start being formed. And this is corresponds also with the oldest text in the Bible, which is the Song of Deborah, which is in Judges 5 or Judges 6, which is a song that predates any of the writing. And so it comes from the oral tradition, and they say that's the oldest strand of the whole Bible. And it's this story about Deborah is this woman who rallies the troops to fight behind Yahweh. And it really does seem to indicate this fighting that was going on at this time during the Bronze Age collapse. And there's a couple of key details in there. One is she talks about it being like this lawless time and things, and raiding people have to take back roads to avoid the bandits. But she also says when the people chose new gods, and that's when they're choosing Yahweh for one, but he's not the only new god. This is also when Zeus emerges, and the Olympians are emerging at the exact same time across the pond over in Greece. The new Olympian pantheon is also forming, and those two cultures are directly parallel. And all the Greek mythology is being written at the same time as the tracts of the Old Testament, and they're totally parallel cultures, parallel patriarchal cultures, putting the women down and putting the goddesses down.
Nice.
And so they've got the full pantheon of gods. El is at the top, and his wife is Asherah. She's mentioned a lot of the time. There's two goddesses that get mentioned in the Old Testament: Asherah and Astarte. So El is the king. El is the father. Asherah is the divine mother. They're the parents of all the gods. Put it in simple terms. And then the important ones are, for the men, are Baal, Yam, and Mot. And Baal, and they are directly equivalent of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades for the Greeks. They're the same thing, but just different names. So Baal is like Zeus. He was the king of the gods. Yam is the god of the sea. And for the Canaanites, Baal and Yam are big rivals. They want to do who's going to be king. And then Mot is like Hades. He's the god of death in the underworld. Mm-hmm. And we know that these are Jewish words because they are, in fact, Jewish words. Yam is the Hebrew word for sea, and Mot is the Hebrew word for death. So that we know that when the Canaanite mythologies talk about these as gods, we know that these were originally Israelite gods as well. And then for the females, we've got Asherah, as I mentioned. Astarte is the same as Ishtar. She's the most popular one. She's the goddess of love and war. Mm-hmm. She's like Aphrodite and Athena combined. So she's a sex goddess, but also the warrior and the masters of civilization. And she's the queen of heaven. She's the top dog. And then her sister is Anet. And Anet is utterly terrifying. She's a death goddess. And are you familiar with Kali of the Hindus?
I have read extensively and forgotten tons. You are refreshing me my knowledge over these conversations.
So Kali she's pretty notable. She's covered in blood. She wears a skull necklace. She's like carrying severed heads and like, dripping in blood, and she's got a belt of human hands. Well, Anet is described in the exact same terms, exact same clothing, a skull necklace, a belt of human hands, slathered in blood, delights in slaughter. All she wants to do is slaughter and kill and destroy. And she is Baal's lover. She's Baal's sister lover. So she is, they are like the divine couple. I was like Baal and Anet. They're like the most powerful gods in Canaanite culture, and they are some pretty terrifying gods. Baal is actually quite terrifying too. They are, if you read their mythology, the Ugaritic texts, I was mentioning the ones that were found from Ugarit, Baal and Anet are like a pretty bloody couple. They kill lots of people all the time and are utterly terrifying. And this is the culture that has infant sacrifice, because like their high gods are like these really terrifying gods. And that's how the Greeks and Romans described the Phoenicians as well. It said that they were the most superstitious people. They were on one hand the most sophisticated and advanced people of the era, lived in luxury and real wealth and finery, but they also had the most superstitious religious beliefs and were clinging to talismans and amulets, and were like the most scared. The Greeks and Romans really made fun of them for it.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, as barbaric as that is, they were also a very, very strong local little empire. And when it was about, if not trade, it was colonization. It was kind of, conquering, wasn't it not?
Actually, they're really interesting people. They were super egalitarian. They were really strong on the goddesses. And they did not really have a military empire. They had a trade colonies, as you mentioned, all over the Mediterranean, but they believed in fair trade and were friendly with the people they would meet and were scrupulous about fair trade.
Boy,
and so they didn't run their own armies. They had mercenary. They only used mercenary armies.
So, however psychologically strict they were with themselves, with infant sacrifice, like everything in life, it's complicated.
It's one of the best paradoxes in history I've come across.
Right.
Because it's so fascinating. It's kind of like America, frankly. It's like, on one hand, we are the most cutting edge, technologically sophisticated country ever. And yet a huge swath of our population believes in really old fashioned, superstitious religious beliefs of like really shit that doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
I really see a lot of parallels to it.
Yeah.
So as we go into the biblical narrative, the followers of Yahweh are they want to put, well, first of all, they're competing with Baal. Yahweh wants to knock off Baal and become king of the gods. This is what's happening in the story of Jezebel, who is all right, let me step back. Most of this narrative happens in the books of First and Second Kings. This is the whole historical part of that tracks the actual historical timeline. Mm-hmm. And if you read those books and line them up against the historical scholarly narrative, what you see is that all the people that are being talked about in the First and Second Kings are all historical people, like the kings of Assyria, the kings of Babylon that come through all the various invasions that happen, the pharaohs of Egypt. They're all historical characters. The kings of Egypt, the kings of Israel and Judah are all, as far as I can tell, they're all historical people. The only ones that are really controversial are King David and King Solomon, for whom scholars don't have clear evidence of their existence.
Right. Yeah.
We do have evidence of House of David back in the day, but not of King David personally. And then King Solomon, there's no evidence for the first temple really, or anything grand, or even that the United Kingdom was ever a united kingdom. Like that all might just be written after the fact. But they do know that Israel and Judah did definitely exist as separate countries in like the archaeological record. They have clear evidence of those nations, and that all the kings of Israel, like King Ahab and all these other characters, were all historical people.
And Israel and Judah, that's post the ascendance of the Yahwists?
Yes. So so Moses, and then we go into after Moses dies. He never enters Israel, but Joshua takes over, and then they're said to have this military campaign, and they go and tear up all over, knock down all these cities like Jericho. The scholars don't think any of that happened.
I've seen other things you've written that have explained it, but now the big question in my head is, it sounds like you're pitting what became Israelites under Moses against Canaanites, whom you've said were the first Israelites or Hebrews.
Well, in the biblical narrative, the biblical writers present them as being separate peoples, like the Israelites were foreigners coming into Canaan, and they have to eliminate all the native peoples.
That's the Israelites under whom?
Under Joshua, and then originally under Moses, then Joshua, and then you get into the kings.
Okay.
King Saul, King David, King Solomon.
Okay. And I'm listening. Once you say Moses, I'm remembering that's Yahwist, because he brought Yahweh into the scene.
He kicks off the Yahweh movement.
But who they go and fight are what you say are Canaanites, but you say those were the first Hebrews.
Well, yeah, the scholars all believe that the Israelites simply are Canaanites, and they're just like fighting amongst themselves.
Thank you.
And there is no distinction between Israelites and Canaanites in the historical record. They are all Canaanites.
Would it help us keep track mentally if we think of Israelites with? No, because you said that's El.
I talk about Yahwists. I talk about the followers of Yahweh as a reform movement within the broader Canaanite community.
Now I remember. Continue, please.
So that's really how I try to present it. This is a pagan culture. The followers of Yahweh. Yahweh is just one more god in this pagan world. but he's a god with an agenda, with a political agenda.
One more cup of coffee, I would have saved us that tangent. Continue.
So yeah, that's the issue. The followers of Yahweh have this political agenda. They don't like Asherah, so they don't like Baal, they don't like Asherah, they don't like Astarte, all for various reasons. Although, we'll just, I don't want to have too many details here. So in the Bible narrative, Asherah is represented with these Asherah poles, which is it's a totem pole. It's like a carved wooden pole. And it's basically the same tradition we have of a Native American totem poles, Siberian totem poles. This is a Indo-European tradition that goes back as far as we can tell. We found one that was 10,000 years old. It is very, very old. And so these are Mother Goddess traditions, just like a maypole for European maypoles. This is all, anytime you see the carved wooden pole, like that's an old Earth Mother tradition that goes back deep into the human psyche, far, far, far back. And so that's what the Asherah pole is. And the followers of Yahweh throughout the text and Kings are always chopping them down and trying to get rid of them. And we see it happening repeatedly. And those are the narratives always talk about there was good kings and there's bad kings. The good followers of in the biblical narrative, according to the biblical writers, a king that is a good king is one of the ones that follows Yahweh. And any of the other kings that backslides and goes back to these pagan traditions, they're the bad kings. But if you actually list them all out, how many there are, you find that there's actually only a handful of quote unquote good kings, and mostly they're bad kings. And that when the nations split into the separate nations of Israel and Judah, all the kings of Israel in the northern kingdom are all bad. There's not one single good king in the whole history of Israel at all. All the good ones come from Judah, which is where Jerusalem is, and where the Yahweh temple is coming out of Jerusalem. But the northern kingdom of Israel is just totally pagan the entire time, even in the biblical narrative. That's not even the scholarship. That's the biblical narrative itself.
Right. And, it's so funny, just as an American raised in the Judeo-Christian ethos as it has existed in America, when you say pagan, I subconsciously and emotionally think evil or demonic. It's so nuts, where it just simply means a belief in multiple gods.
Yeah, the Greeks and Romans were pagans.
Right. I just wanted to mention that.
No, I agree. I know that
in case I look scared, that's
well, it reminds me of, you remember that old movie Dragnet? It was like a comedy with Dan Aykroyd, and it was a TV show originally, but then they made a movie of it.
Yeah,
with Tom Hanks, I think, and Dan Aykroyd. It wasn't like that big of a hit or anything.
I didn't see it, but I remember it. Yeah,
but there was the bad guys are like this pagan motorcycle gang, and like they're doing all this all this bad stuff, and so they turned pagan into an acronym. They said people against goodness and normalcy.
And you know what? There's a lot of Americans and Christians who that's the default. That's the trigger.
Totally.
That's funny.
So yeah, no, I get where that comes from, and it took me a while to just meditate on the word pagan for a while until I just got used to saying it. But it's the most descriptive word. Polytheistic is like too many syllables. It's too hard to say.
Yeah, but there's something pagan because it was used as an epithet, as a slur. And to the listener out there, it's okay to understand the word pagan this new way, and it would be new anyway.
Yeah, it just means polytheistic, and
right. And you can't throw that out knee jerk, because you're throwing out what naturally occurred or developed or arose among your family of humanity thousands of years ago, for whatever reasons, quite naturally, whatever.
I think it's important to understand where these people are coming from. It's important to understand the traditions that got thrown out, because they don't actually entirely go away from human culture. And it helps us frame this conversation for today, because I think that, there's a lot of things that this will come back to the modern day, and we'll bring it back there later. But for instance, just like framing sexual ethics between like Christian purity culture at one extreme end, which has its own levels of toxicity, with this other complete alternative extreme at the other end of like intentionally bringing your daughters to the prostitution temple, where it's just like these two absolute extremes of human sexual ethics, that I think we need to sort of like try and find something somewhere in between
Well, also, folks do things largely, I hope and believe, because they think they're doing the right thing,
of course.
and they think they're doing a good thing, if not a helpful thing. So if sex helps food grow and nature blossom, giddy up.
Yeah, I think they believe that. I literally think they believe that for thousands of years, and there was like.
And I want to say I want to just insert one comment or thought about paganism before letting you continue with the narrative. I've thought about early humans, pre-language and growing a bigger brain and starting to make sense of things. And to me, it's a no-brainer to imagine people, anything that moved, they would think is alive. Okay. So even breezes through the trees and through the grass, they don't have a concept of wind and air pressure and things like that. They just see the grass blowing and the wind on their face, and they could think, well, that's alive. So that's the spirit of the wind, and that's the spirit of the grass. It's the spirit of the trees. It's the spirit of the lion. It's the spirit of. So yeah, man. Yeah. And okay, so that's fun. All right, back to you in the narrative here.
So yeah, the Asherah and the Asherah poles. And so you see repeatedly of these admonitions for the followers of Yahweh to knock over the altars to Baal and the Asherah poles standing next to them, and put up altars for Yahweh. Interestingly enough, though, in the historical, for the scholars, for the archaeologists, they find altars to Yahweh standing next to altars of Asherah. And so that for a long time, Yahweh was being worshipped alongside Asherah, just as she'd been worshipped alongside Baal. Because the way I see it is that as the mother goddess, she is being, she gives approval to whichever god is being chosen as king. She gives his approval. That's why the Asherah pole stands next to all those other altars. It's not because
go ahead.
She's not Yahweh's wife. She's Yahweh's mother.
Right. And I have enough, knowledge of Freud to imagine that a culture that wants to please a female goddess or attract her good graces would erect a pole as a symbol or a gift to her. Make of that what you will. And you also see how things get kind of co-opted. If those poles predated Egyptian culture, we've got the obelisks, which is it's a tall pole with, in my opinion, a pyramid at the top.
Right.
And the significance of a pyramid, we could say for another conversation, but it's really, really intense.
Well, we can have a whole conversation about Washington, D.C. and all the Freemasonry and occult symbolism here in D.C. That's a favorite topic of mine.
Yeah. And those who want to get up to speed quickly, you could get this book, God School 9/11 and JFK by Bruce DeTorres. Hey, that's me at tryingtheday.com. Ed?
So, I mean, we could go through, we're not going to do it in this podcast, but in my book, I go through it, the entire scriptural narrative of like each king and like what stories is each one happening. As we go through, King David takes Jerusalem around the year 1000 as as an historical event. And that's when Jerusalem becomes, the place for Yahweh and his followers. And then in the Bible narrative, they say there's a united kingdom of this big kingdom of Israel.
By the way, that's 1000 BC. I don't know if you said BC, just to remind
1000
folks.
BC, yeah, 1000 BC. So 3,000 years ago, exactly 3,000 years ago. King David dies. His son, King Solomon, takes over. And King Solomon is said to be the wisest, wealthiest, most successful of all the Hebrew kings. And he is a great goddess worshiper. He's heavily criticized for his worship of Astarte. And he's got all these wives and concubines, and he loves women, and he's like this, sensual guy. He also writes he's credited, right? He's credited with all these writings. The scholars don't think even existed, and they all debate when the stuff is written. And I'm not even going to get into that. But King Solomon, by tradition, is credited with writing Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. Now, Song of Songs is like the only feminine book in the entire Bible where that's sensual, that's romantic, that a woman has a voice, and that it's all lovey-dovey. And that is thought to be a leftover from these liturgies of Ishtar, of Astarte, that there were sacred marriage ceremonies and all these ritualists, again, these ritual romance stuff. And the Song of Songs is a leftover from those old liturgies. And scholars are pretty confident about that, and I think it's totally true. And then in Proverbs, King Solomon kicks off the wisdom traditions where he's describing wisdom as she, and she was alongside Yahweh as he laid the foundations of the earth. And it's really presenting her as like a goddess. And this kicks off the whole traditions of Sophia in the Greek traditions. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and she becomes herself like a goddess. And Sophia is, a very important tradition in, Orthodox Christianity and in Greeks and all over the place.
And philosophy, the word philosophy means love of wisdom.
Right.
And there's Sophie in there.
And so King Solomon is the one who kicks that off. And I say that King Solomon is sort of this bridge between the visceral pagan goddesses and the wisdom traditions. He's the one who bridges that, who's the catalyst for making that shift. King Solomon is my favorite character from the Old Testament, for sure.
I wonder, or I hope, go where you want next, but right here in the narrative is where I'm reminded what you've taught me about the banishing of the divine mother, the divine feminine, and the harms that it has caused ever since, and the healing and the hope and the possibilities and the reunification of the sexes available today. If people can wrap their minds around how unnatural a monotheistic, patriarchal, male-dominated culture society is, if not suicidal, tyrannical, and the hope of integrating these
that's why I think energies. We need more of a talk about spirituality in the public square, and why we need to break free of this conversation of it. So either we've been locked into this choice between either you believe in God in the Christian sense or you don't believe in God in the atheist sense. And I think we need to break free of that false dichotomy.
You've well explored that in the past, and you can in the future, unless you want to go back to you want to go back to the narrative you wanted to unpack for us today.
No, let's stick with King Solomon here for a sec. One thing I found in coming back to reading the Bible again as an adult after having not read it really for a long time was that I really found that those three books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, really spoke to me. And then I really found a lot of wisdom and a lot of value in all three of those books. And that they were really they were not hokum or BS at all. I found incredible value today for me personally in all three of those books. Of all the books of the Old Testament, those three books, I think I would challenge any atheist to read it and not find value in it. Because if you don't find some value in those books, I would have to question that person, frankly. So King Solomon dies wealthy, fat, rich, and happy in his bed, surrounded by all the women that loved him. If he had been pissing off God didn't show it, because he died happy. But his son was a ne'er-do-well. His son is Rehoboam, and he's a bad king. And that prompts a revolt from Jeroboam, who was the leader of the Israelites. And so there's all this politics going on. But long story short, it's basically a labor revolt. King Rehoboam had been pushing the workers too hard in forced labor. And Jeroboam said, if you don't lay off, we're asking you politely now to lay off. And Rehoboam says, my father scourged you with whips, and I will scourge you with scorpions, and doubles down on him. And so this is when Israel promptly revolts, and they split into two separate countries, the separate nations of Israel and Judah. And there's no more.
Say this king's name slowly, please.
Yeah, they're very similar spellings. Rehoboam, Rehoboam.
Thank you.
Is King Solomon's ne'er-do-well son.
Thank you. I just needed to catch it. That's all. Yeah.
And then Jeroboam with a J is the leader of the revolt. And he becomes the first king of Israel. And the first thing he does is they want to break away from the leadership in the Jerusalem temple. And so they build two new golden bulls in the towns of Bethel and Dan. Bethel is in the south and Dan is in the north. And they built two new big golden bulls, just like they had done at Mount Sinai. And those bulls would stand there for the entire existence of the nation of Israel for the next couple of years.
Bulls.
The golden bull, the golden calf, golden bull.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's golden
And is
calf.
that and was that breakaway? Which one was Israel and which one was Judah at this breakaway, at this separation?
So the city of Jerusalem is in Judah, and it's in the south, and it's smaller. It's more of a rump state.
And that was kept in the legacy of the Rehoboam.
Yeah. No, he kept on being king.
Okay.
King Solomon. Yeah, the house of David rules from Judah, and they would continue to rule Judah for a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so the house of David stays in charge of Judah for centuries.
And Jeroboam,
he goes he starts off Israel, but his family doesn't stay in charge for very long. They have a series of coups over the time.
And his territory is north and south of Jerusalem.
No, he's got the kingdom of Israel is north of the kingdom of Judah. It's bigger and it's more prosperous.
Oh, you confused me with the bull you said was south of Jerusalem.
If I misspoke, Judah is south and Israel is north.
Well, you've made that clear now. So
all right. Trying to be clear.
You are.
And so these are historical countries. Israel was more prosperous. It was allied with the Phoenicians, and they periodically fought with Judah, but not always, but they fought a lot. And they were pagan the entire time. And but the Hebrew prophets would go to Israel and keep telling them to repent and go back and come back to Yahweh.
The Hebrew from the
followers of Yahweh.
That would be the Judeans, Judean Hebrews versus the Israelite Hebrews.
Yeah, the terms are, I think they're all Hebrews. I think they're all,
I'm following you, and everyone's following you.
I basically refer to the followers of Yahweh as the Yahwehs. And they're like,
I like that. No, that's a very nice distinction. Just wanted to thank you. Continue.
I want to thank, and I want you to help me make sure I'm being clear too, because there's a lot of different details and there's a lot of pretty big tapestry here to try and spin together.
Well, it's fun as heck to have people who've grown up with this and have thought about it. Go ahead.
So you'll see the Yahwist prophets going into Israel to confront the various leadership there and tell them how bad they are. One of the main ones being the whole story with Jezebel and King Ahab. So Jezebel is a real historical person. She was queen of Israel, and she's reviled in the Old Testament as the worst of the women and the most. She's one of the most reviled characters in the whole Bible, right? And her name lives on as the symbolic of the temptress and the shrew and the woman who's to be manipulative of. Her husband and be manipulative behind the scenes, right? And so she's a real person, though. She was actually a real person, and her husband, King Ahab, was also actually a pretty important warrior and fought in some pretty big wars. And they were real. And so, who is it? It's Elijah. Elijah is the one who challenges Ahab and Jezebel to the battle of the prophets on Mount Carmel, which is a pretty famous story where he says, bring out your 450 prophets of Baal and your 400 prophets of Asherah and come meet me on top of the Mount Carmel, and we'll see whose God is the more powerful God. And so they set up this event where they put a bull on the altar and they say, but you're not allowed to light it on fire. And you've just got to pray to your gods, and whichever God will light the bull on fire, that's the more powerful God. And so they agree to this. And the prophets of Baal go first, and they do their altar, and they spend the whole day dancing around and ultimately getting more and more frantic. And they start flagellating themselves and make themselves bleed and praying and dancing frantically. But their gods never show up, and the bull never burns to fire. So then Elijah says, now it's my turn. And he's got his altar of limestone. They're all limestone altars. That was the stone that's up there. And he prepares his altar. And then he pours these buckets of water on there, on the bull. And all of a sudden, the whole thing erupts in flames and consumes the entire bull. And Elijah declares victory and says, obviously my God Yahweh is more powerful than your God Baal, and orders all the prophets of Baal to be killed. and and the whole crowd rounds up the 450 prophets of Baal and throws them all off the cliff. Do you remember this story from the
Broad strokes?
yeah? So but pointedly, they don't say anything about killing the prophets of Asherah. They only kill the prophets of Baal. They don't touch the prophets of Asherah. They never kill the prophets of Asherah. The prophets of Asherah are left alone. But I have in my book, I talk about how this is quite possibly a magic trick. That what Elijah did was actually do like a magician's trick, and that there's a chemistry that they use, that the Greeks used to make this incendiary weapon that they called Greek fire. And it's a mix of when you burn limestone, it changes chemistry and it becomes what's called quicklime. And then if you mix quicklime with sulfur and with naphtha is like Zippo lighter fluid. It's like a really light fossil fuel, but it looks just like water and it blends with water. So naphtha plus sulfur plus quicklime erupts into this like really dramatic flames. And so it was suggested that was what Elijah is doing, is that it says explicitly that he's using an old altar. So that old altar would already be burned and have quicklime on it. And then he, if you mix some sulfur in there surreptitiously, like powdered sulfur, and then these buckets of water that he's pouring out are actually buckets of naphtha, that actually would do exactly what is described. The whole thing would erupt in flames and consume the entire bull in this really dramatic fashion. So I argue in my book that it's just this big magic trick that they use to, baffle them and then go kill all the prophets of Baal. So that's a pretty good story. There's another incident where this guy, so the guy that ends up killing Jezebel eventually gets assassinated in a coup. And she gets thrown from a window. This is a very famous story, the defenestration of Jezebel. It's all very symbolic when she's thrown from the window and then the dogs eat her bones and there's nothing left but her hands and feet. The guy who orders that killing is this guy Jehu, who's like a military commander who stages a coup and he becomes king. He also goes and orders he's a quite murderous fellow when he performs his coup. And so he kills he goes and has all the people come to the temple of Baal, says that we're going to have after he takes over as king, murdering the previous kings, he orders everybody to go to the temple of Baal for a big public offering. And when everybody's inside, he bolts the door and has his commandos kill everybody inside and burn down the entire temple. And that's how they institute the Yahweh worship over the Baal worship in Israel. But Jehu's not really a pure Yahwist. He's like a pagan Yahwist, and he doesn't really like do it properly. And then there's other characters too. Then the big reforms are, because we're going to cut this short here before we get to the end. There's two major reformer kings that actually do big time reforms, and they are Hezekiah and Josiah. And Hezekiah is also a historical figure. He was a king in Jerusalem at the time that the Assyrians were the dominant power, military power coming out of Mesopotamia, and they were dominating everybody and attacking. Historically speaking, they came from being they expanded their power and attacked all the Phoenician states and took over Syria, Lebanon. They took over everything, and then they eventually destroyed Israel. They turned Israel to a vassal state and eventually destroyed Israel, and they attacked Judah. And we have Assyrian records and biblical records of the same events, which is actually a pretty interesting comparison to be made there. And so Hezekiah manages to defend Jerusalem. So the Assyrians come through and they actually lay waste to all of Judah. They destroy all the other cities, and they trap Hezekiah. They lay siege to Jerusalem for months, but they don't actually break through. And Hezekiah was actually able to hold off the Assyrians. The Assyrians leave. It's kind of a long story. And Hezekiah is hailed as this absolute savior for the Jews. And he is like this really pivotal figure. It's around 700 BC. And if he had been like at that point, the followers of Yahweh and the house of David were like reduced to like this barest flickering of a candle. They were almost wiped from existence. They were almost gone, but only through this miracle, basically, they were able to survive. And the house
Was
of
that when they
David's
were on
God.
top of a mountain, maybe Messina? Is that it? Is that the right word? And is that the same event?
No, that's a different event.
Okay.
This is a story in Kings. It's in the Bible.
We don't have to.
Yeah. So, but Hezekiah is a major reformer for Yahweh, and he shuts down a lot of the temples, shuts down the pagan temple. One thing that they do is they want to centralize worship in the Jerusalem temple. So they go around and shut down all the community altars out in the countryside, and they knock down the altars to the goddesses and things. Hezekiah does this, but then as soon as Hezekiah dies, his son, the next king, comes back and restores all the pagan traditions back, and is actually a much more popular king. That's Manasseh, and he has a very long rule, and he's very prosperous. But the biblical writers hate him. But the archaeologists say that this guy was actually, he has the longest rule. He's a king for like 40 years, and was incredibly prosperous and totally brought back all the pagan traditions. And then when he dies, his son or grandson is Josiah, who's the second great reformer, and that's in the 600s BC, the next century. And he's the second one who's hailed as a great reformer. He also overturns all the altars, and archaeologists have actually found these overturned altars, and they actually found some evidence of these reforms. And they also cut down the Asherah poles. They grind them up and disinter the graves of the old priests of Asherah, and burn down some temples. But again, they're totally unpopular reforms with the people. And when Josiah dies and he gets himself killed in a battle that he didn't need to go to, and he gets himself killed on the battlefield, and as soon as he dies, they go right back to the paganism again, and there's really no more followers of Yahweh, because actually it's not long after that the Babylonians come through. They've defeated the Assyrians. The Babylonians come through and they attack Jerusalem and take Jerusalem, and then they burn down everything, kill everybody, send the elite into exile. They don't kill everybody, but they send all the elite into exile and leave only behind the poor people, and and that's the Babylonian exile. And so, long story short,
right? That might be a good
no, that's where we're going to
narrative.
wrap it up. Yeah.
Right.
So long story short, they were pagan the entire time,
Right.
all the way up to the Babylonian exile. They were
Right.
never monotheists. They were not Jews. They never knew the idea of monotheism. All the monotheism, the Bible gets written in Babylon during the exile, and all the concepts of monotheism emerge at that time. And El and Yahweh are fused into one God.
Right.
After the exile.
What century would you put that in? What century is this in?
The traditional scholarly or traditional rabbinical dating for the completion of the Torah, or like the
exile.
Jerusalem is destroyed in 586 BC. They are sent into exile, and then Cyrus the Great of the Persians defeats the Babylonians and takes Babylon around 75 years later. So like 510, 520.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to just put that.
And this is important because Cyrus is friendly to the Jews. And he says, you can go back to Jerusalem, you can rebuild your temple, and here's some money. And they sponsor them. And that's when the Torah gets written. Right. And that's when they start hanging out with the Zoroastrians, and you get all this that's when Judaism really comes together.
Before you say goodbye, I want to ask, have you ever read by Jim Mars a book called Rule by Secrecy?
No.
It recounts the Sumerian story, relying heavily on Zecharia Sitchin's work about it, and that Bronze Age collapse might happen when Jim Mars describes those previous civilizations may have been phenomenally more advanced than mainstream history accounts for. So much so, this might sound bizarre to someone who hasn't done the research on it, that part of that upheaval and cataclysm and destruction, there is circumstantial evidence, if not physical evidence, to indicate that it may have been the destruction with really advanced technology, possibly even in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Ed, nuclear weaponry of some kind. And this is based on scientific analysis of the residue. And this goes into, opening up that whole can of worms about
So actually,
our origins and how advanced civilizations may have been back then.
well, I do think they were more sophisticated in certain regards. I don't know about technology per se. One of the things that happens with Bronze Age collapse is you get iron weapons, and this is one of the things that's changing is you get new powers with new sources of material. But back to the one about Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. There's actually I saw a paper just recently that posited that they may have actually been hit by an asteroid in the historical record, that they were actually may have been hit by an extraterrestrial object.
Well,
and there were witnesses to it, and so this story actually translates. So and then people are asking the question, why was that city destroyed? And they say, because they were sinners. Just like the right wingers.
Well, sure, yeah, right. And you blame it on the God you want to scare and manipulate people into following your interpretation of. But the historical description of the impact of an asteroid, I think it tracks with, isn't there columns of fire? And that's in the Bible. But I just submit it could be the same visual description of a mushroom cloud, of a nuclear detonation. I'm not espousing that.
Yeah, I'd have to hear his theory of how they would have nukes back then.
I'm just telling you. Yeah, no. Jim Mars wrote "Ruled by Secrecy," subtitle, I think, "The Hidden History," that connects the Egyptian pyramids and the Freemasons and the Trilateral Commission, because he's showing how its legacy into what the Masons did, not only in street plots in Washington, D.C., and the other Egyptian symbology that has survived. Well summarized in my book, God School 9/11 and JFK, and point to discuss in the future. But I do believe it would be a great time for a little wrap up and
let's wrap it up and
give us a preview of things to come.
Yeah, there's so much more to be said on these subjects. It's a really deep dive, and the idea is just to get used to the idea that the history we've been taught isn't always true. The history is written by the winners. History books are written by the winners, and that they've always got an agenda that they're presenting. And now that we're learning new things from archaeology and scholarship and the internet that disseminates all this information, we can really re-embrace our history and start to learn from what was going on in the past and try and find some insights for things that are happening today. Because I think there's a lot of stuff we can talk about from the past that affects us today.
Endlessly.
So, Bruce, it was great talking to you this morning, and have a good one. Anything else you want to say on the way out the door here?
No, I can't wait for the next one.
All right. Well, till next time, Bruce Torres, Edward Dodge, Lost Goddess IO podcast, and we'll be seeing you guys around.